welcome everyone again, and thank you so much for joining us for this conversation about unlocking finance for locally led adaptation. We'll be exploring different methodologies for overcoming blockages in adaptation finance and getting money to where it's needed most. We'll be hearing from some fantastic speakers doing really important work and really innovating in the space and trying to move us forward in an area that we all know is very challenging. So my name is Georgina Kandel-Kemp, and I work at the International Development Research Centre, or the IDRC. At the IDRC, I work on the Step Change Initiative, which is a 5-year partnership between Canada's IDRC and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. The overarching goal of Step Change is to drive equitable and inclusive locally led adaptation. And we do that, amongst other things, by investing in what we call climate knowledge brokers. And I'll talk a bit to that later on. Step Change support for locally led adaptation extends to 27 organizations currently, and these organizations are active in 19 countries in Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. My colleague Maria will post a brochure about the program in the chat, and you can have a look at that. This webinar today is the third in a series of webinars that are being held between now and October, where the Step Change community is coming together and reflecting on various aspects of the work that they do to support equitable and inclusive locally led adaptation. We've had one webinar on the role of intermediaries in locally led adaptation. The recording for that is available. You can email us. We'll put our email address in the chat. We've had another on how research ethics play in this knowledge brokering space. And today we're here to discuss finance. We also have a couple more on the horizon, dealing with gender equality and social inclusion, and also on equitable Southern-based partnerships. So please keep your eyes open for those via LinkedIn. So let me begin then today by just spending a moment reflecting on what locally led adaptation is. The starting point is very simple. People and communities on the front lines of climate change are often the best positioned to develop adaptation solutions that fit with their values, that fit with their needs, and that fit with their aspirations for the future. Yet historically, and still to today, these communities have also tended to be excluded from decision-making about their futures, and they often lack access to the resources, financial and otherwise, to lead the implementation of adaptation solutions in the places where they live. So in this context, locally led adaptation is about shifting power to local actors. It's about devolving decision-making to the lowest possible level. And it's also about providing patient and predictable funding and also flexible programming that is adaptive to changing local conditions. And so when I talk about locally led adaptation as being about shifting power to local actors, I think you can start to understand why we're here to explore access to adaptation finance for locally led adaptation. And so I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Jonas Atella. He's co-moderating with me today to sort of set the scene around finance for locally led adaptation and why that matters. If you hear speakers refer to LLA, we're talking about locally led adaptation. We'll all try not to use jargon as much as possible. Jonas is the Executive Director of the Africa Research and Impact Network. He's also the lead on a project entitled Locally Led Adaptation Metrics for Africa, or LLAMA, one of our Step Change funded projects. And I'll hand over to Jonas now. Thanks, Jonas.
Thank you so much, Georgina, and thanks to all our participants who have made time to be part of this conversation. This is a very timely conversation in the sense that, as Georgina has said, local-led adaptation is around shifting the powers, shifting technologies to be able to strengthen local leadership with regards to adaptation interventions. But as we know that the climate change the climate financing infrastructure is a bit imbalanced in the sense that the global systems vis-a-vis the local systems, there's a bit of misalignment. If we are talking about investments in locally led adaptation, especially, for instance, the through the private sector investments. We know that the private sector investments are tied to market systems, market institutions, some of which are not well developed at the local system, where the social, perspectives are more important. So we see that gap between the broader financial system for climate change and the local systems where this financing is needed. And therefore, that brings us to the biggest question, which is, and what we want to answer or discuss in this particular webinar, about how do we bridge that particular gap? How is power being shifted to ensure that the current constellation of climate finance has some, power balance in the context of including the local leadership, the local systems, to be able to access not just quantity or large amount of financing for adaptation, but also quality of funding. So this is a fundamental question. But again, the good news is that there are already many people who are working in this space. We have knowledge brokers, we have intermediaries, we have organizations and cases that are trying to bridge this gap and trying to shift the power to enable finance, climate finance, to be more equitable with regards to the needs of the most vulnerable and marginalized communities in our systems. And therefore, this webinar is basically to try and understand how this is happening. How are these knowledge brokers, how are these organizations really co-creating ideas around local climate financing? How are they bringing down the big powers to ensure that there's alignment with the local vulnerabilities? So these are fundamental questions that perhaps we may not be able to answer all of them in this particular webinar. But again, understanding how this is happening, some of the cases for co-creation, some of the barriers that these particular knowledge brokers experience when trying to really link these two levels of climate finance, and how they are doing that. But most importantly, what are some of the best practices that are emerging? Because this is a very fundamental debate around how to shift the powers to ensure that local people access finance. What are those best practices that can be scaled out and can enhance investments in climate finance or adaptation finance, for that matter, in a way that strengthens local leadership? And this is a conversation that we want to have in this webinar. And we hope that the insights and examples and cases that will be shared in this discussion will help us to really progress the debate around securing and enhancing climate finance for locally led adaptation. Over to you, Georgina.
Thanks, Jonas. So I've stopped sharing the screen, and I'd invite our speakers just to make sure that your cameras are on. So back to me for introduction. So I said right at the beginning that Step Change invests in what we call climate knowledge brokers. But what are brokers? And I'm not assuming that everybody knows what we mean. Knowledge brokers are intermediary actors who connect different knowledge holders and different power holders in society, and they broker much more than just knowledge. They tend to broker relationships. They connect people who might not traditionally work together. They build trust, and through doing all of those things, they drive climate action. So let's meet some knowledge brokers. I'm very pleased to introduce you to our speakers today. First up, I'll introduce you to Megan Spires. Megan, if you could just wave to the audience so they know who you are. Megan is the Director of Climate Change, Energy and Resilience at ICLEI Africa. Megan leads the Bridge Project. Within Step Change, the Bridge Project establishes mechanisms, methodologies and processes that unlock finance for locally led and gender responsive adaptation. And they prioritize the most vulnerable communities living in Cameroonian cities. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Pauline Makutsa. Pauline is a programs manager at the Adaptation Consortium. The Adaptation Consortium, or ADA, works to support county governments in Kenya to mainstream climate change into development and planning through a specific mechanism which she will describe to us today. Welcome, Pauline. Thanks for joining us. Next, it's a pleasure to introduce you to Emil Harikishan. Emil, could you wave? Emil is the Climate Finance Thematic Lead for the Climate and Development Knowledge Network, or CDKN. Under Step Change, CDKN accelerates equitable and financed locally led adaptation to climate change and specifically supports the voice and climate leadership of marginalized groups. Welcome, Emil. And last but not least, my very dear colleague, Bim Adhikari. Bim is a senior program specialist at the IDRC. He's part of the Sustainable and Inclusive Economies Division, and Bim works with research teams around the world who are dedicated to unlocking climate finance in all its forms and has done so for many, many years. Welcome, Bim. Thanks for joining us. So without further ado then, let me share my screen again. And I'm going to, oh no, I'm not going to share my screen, excuse me. Megan, I invite you to take the floor.
Thanks, Tina. Thank you. Colleagues and attendees, thank you very much for having ICLEI Africa form part of this webinar today. And as Jonas has indicated, this is such a critical topic for discussion, and we think that's why there's been such interest in the conversation today, and looking forward to the discussion a bit later on. What I'll spend 5 minutes sharing from my perspective are two things. One is ICLEI's journey in working in the space of unlocking finance for city-scale action, and then how that links specifically to the Bridge project that Georgina has mentioned, which is a project under the Step Change program that we're implementing as ICLEI Africa that very specifically focuses on adaptation finance, but adaptation finance that is locally led and gender responsive as being core to the work that we're doing. So I think it's been widely documented and broadly accepted as to why cities are central to tackling climate change. I'm not going to spend any time there. And so there's been an evolution in terms of our work, which is always focused on cities and local scale action, to make sure that we look at ways in which finance can be unlocked for this action. In a sense, without finance, work gets stuck within policies, and we're well aware of the challenges around policy to implementation, and finance is a core component of that. And so with this recognition of the need for more city-scale finance to tackle climate change, there has been a proliferation of what one would call project preparation facilities or technical assistance programs to try and assist cities across the world, but also in Africa, gain access to climate finance. And there's been many lessons along the road. We certainly ourselves have been involved in establishing these project preparation facilities. We've done many calls over the years to receive project ideas and concept notes from cities, and we've always been inundated. So there certainly is no lack of buy-in from cities in terms of recognizing the importance of this challenge. We've undertaken things like matchmaking events and activities, twinning donors and DFIs with cities. And all of this has brought us closer to refining, instead of the conversation simply being about the barriers and the challenges, not to understate the importance of them, but shift the conversation forward to now being talking about what are the opportunities and where are the refined, very focused areas of intervention that we should be looking at to ensure that we actually stop talking and see implementation on the ground. And what our lessons have been is that there is a fundamental role that is often undervalued and under-resourced, and that is the role of knowledge brokers in being able to circumvent, extract, make the gaps not as wide as they've been in the past, and that is knowledge brokers. And so where we've seen success in our projects trying to unlock finance at the local level is where there's been funding for knowledge brokers to operate. And these knowledge brokers, this is not typical TA. This is the kind of trust building, relationship building, gathering of data, bridging of different partners, often from very different sectors and different scales of action, to walk that long road with our city partners to ultimately see finance unlocked. and in doing so to work with development finance institutes that recognize the role of cities, and they themselves have established their own project preparation facilities tailored towards city scale finance. And our best success stories are when we're actually able to work with these DFIs transparently. We know what criteria they use to allow projects to enter into their more advanced project preparation facilities. We develop projects tailored to such, and those projects then enter into those facilities and ultimately are implemented. So we're taking the learnings over many, many years of working in the space and now really trying to apply that in the Bridge project, focused on adaptation finance, which even more so than mitigation and energy finance, we know about the gaps and the barriers that relate to such. Our project's a year in, but we've certainly already had significant lessons and learnings along the way. What we're doing at the moment is tackling what is often a fundamental barrier to widening the circle of who knows about what finance is available and then gains access to such, and breaking down the power dynamics and widening the circle of the who's in and who's out in terms of being able to access that finance. And that issue is tackling transparency. And we're doing this in Cameroon by mapping both knowledge brokers that are local and operating in the Cameroonian landscape, but also mapping the finance flows in Cameroon. And this is both in terms of where the finance is coming from, what is being utilized before, how it is or isn't being tagged as adaptation finance. And then most importantly, and this often comes through bilateral and group conversations, understanding how locally led and gender responsive that adaptation finance is. And key to this has also been about dispelling distortions. What we're certainly finding is there's much more transparent reporting, almost by a middle line of projects, so that are through bilateral institutions, for instance, less transparency on the multi-million rand large programs, and then also less transparency around the smaller grassroots implementation projects. And that simply comes down to the capacity of local organizations to report on the pros and the cons, the lessons and the opportunities from that piece of work. So through Bridge, running these mapping exercises in parallel to co-production processes, to increase transparency through the mapping, to break down power dynamics, to crowd in those that should be part of the conversation that haven't been in the past, ultimately aiming to lead to a couple of project outputs, and I'll stop there then, Georgina. One is a set of criteria that we've co-produced with the relevant players in the Cameroonian landscape in terms of adaptation finance, and those criteria moving us more towards adaptation finance that leads to locally led and gender responsive adaptation action. Working on adjusting an existing financial mechanism that's already in place and funneling money to local actors to ensure that these criteria are then being applied. And then also in developing specific city scale projects that are then utilizing these criteria and also taking advantage of an adjusted financial mechanism or a new financial mechanism that we've co-produced with players in Cameroon. So ambitious goals, we hope to get as close as possible to achieving them, but certainly this for us is a refinement of our learnings in the adaptation space. And we look forward to seeing further results in the years to come. Thanks, Georgina.
Thanks, Megan. Yeah, just quite remarkable how long ICLEI Africa and also ICLEI South Asia, who I see is on the line and has posted something in the Q&A, but how long, in this case, ICLEI Africa has been working in the space. And as you say, the sort of lack of support often for this brokering work has been a barrier. So that's really interesting. But that rich experience, and you were talking about the long road, walking that long road with all of these stakeholders. Yeah, really, really interesting, and picked up on your co-production approach, increasing transparency. And you often speak about quality finance, Megan. I didn't hear you speak about it here, but maybe that could be something in the Q&A, but this idea of integrating gender equality and social inclusion right into the design of these projects, a really important aspect, I think, also of your work. Let me share my screen again. So now I think let's move on to Pauline. Please, anyone, if you have specific questions for Megan, put them in the Q&A. There will also be an opportunity once we've heard from everyone to raise your hands and voice any comments or questions that you have. For now, though, I'm going to hand over to Pauline, who's going to give us some insights from a fascinating longitudinal study of finance for locally led adaptation in Kenya. So we're sort of moving from a city scale to a county scale, and thinking about those connections also to national finance policy and opportunities. Pauline, can I hand over to you? And just confirm, please, that you can see my screen, Pauline.
Yes, I can see your screen. Thank you very much. And good afternoon, colleagues. I am happy this afternoon to make a short presentation on the work that we are doing here in Kenya with regards to devolving climate finance. Next slide, please. So the Adaptation Consortium works to support county governments in Kenya by mainstreaming climate change into development planning through county climate change fund mechanism. The CCCF was designed to provide legal and institutional framework that would enable financial and other resources to reach the lowest level of governance in Kenya, which is the board level, and enable local communities to make decisions with regard to how these resources would be used to address their climate challenges through adaptation and resilience projects. So the mechanism was piloted in 5 counties in Kenya. Those are our sub-national governments of Makueni, Kitui, Isiolo, Garissa, and Wajir from 2013 through to 2018. Actually, it began a little bit earlier, like from 2010. And currently, following the success of that mechanism, it is now being scaled out nationally, supported by a World Bank project to all the other counties in Kenya, and some financing of around 305 million from the World Bank, combined with an own contribution from each county of around 23 million USD. Next slide, please. So with regard to how the CCF is getting financing down to local communities, there are several factors that have enabled this to happen. One, it is a legal framework that is anchored both in the national and subnational legislation. This protects it from any political interference or any other kind of interference. Besides, it makes it a commitment for the subnational governments, the county governments, to put aside some of their own finances, providing a sure amount of resources every year for climate action. It establishes robust institutional structures at the county government and at community level that require broad stakeholder involvement. For example, at the community level, there is what is called the World Climate Change Planning Committee, and it is supposed to be broadly representative of all kinds of community stakeholders, including women and men, the old and the youth, civil society organizations, marginalized and minority communities, private sector, and at the structure at the county level has multi-sectoral government expertise because of the nature of climate change. Thirdly, it requires the county government to make a financial commitment, which ranges between 2 to 3% of its annual development budget. This provides consistent and reliable finances for climate action. It is also flexible to allow climate finances from other sources, be they national, international, or from the private sector. The mechanism gives communities the mandate to determine which climate actions will be funded. The final decision is made by communities who are best placed to determine what support they need in terms of climate actions to help build their adaptation and resilience. Then finally, it requires a high level of transparency and accountability and information between the government and the communities and any other stakeholder that may have put in finances into the fund, so as to enable the continued flow of finances into the mechanism. Next slide, please. So the pilot, we undertook a pilot of this mechanism between 2013 and 2018. And in this pilot, over 100 locally led climate adaptation projects or investments were implemented across those 5 ASAL counties. And because they were ASAL counties, most of the projects were actually water projects because that is the greatest climate challenge in these counties. And they aimed at improving the availability and access of water for domestic and livelihood uses. Therefore, currently, as we're speaking, the mechanism is being scaled out to the rest of the counties, but we wanted to find out from the counties that had begun this process and have had about almost 10 years of trying out the mechanism in its various forms. Is it a successful mechanism? Is the money actually reaching the communities? And then what is happening after the projects are implemented? So in 2019, an assessment of 62 of the locally led climate investments was undertaken to find out the status of these investments, including the technical functionalities. Are they still operational? Are they providing the services they're supposed to provide? What is the governance and management structure, and how does this affect the functionality of these investments? And also to provide lessons on community perspectives and experiences on locally led climate investments that should enable the new counties that are coming on board to learn from this and not make the same mistakes that the pilot counties made. Next slide, please. And then last year, a repeat assessment of the same 62 investments was undertaken. And this was 10 years after the very first investments was made and 4 years after the last investments were made. Here I have really summarized the study. And so out of this study, if you look at the comparative analysis from the 2019 study and the 2023 study, about only 14.5% in 2019 and 20% of the investments in 2023 were completely non-functional. This means there was no hope of getting any benefit from those investments. They were completely run down and there was no way they could be restarted. However, about 80.5% in 2019 and 80% in 2023 of these investments were in various levels of functionality, meaning for it to be functional, it means they were providing the service that was expected, providing water in adequate quantities for the community. They were punctually functional. For example, they could access the water, but perhaps the piping system was not in place or were not currently in use. This was mainly because of the very extended and severe drought that was had over 3 years. So some of the water investments just had not been refilled because most of the investments were water pans and boreholes and the like. So when you look at just a cursory look at these results, we'll find that 4 to 10 years after the investments, the communities, most of these communities were still benefiting from the investments that had been made under this mechanism. Next slide, please. Okay, so some of the key lessons, if I could just summarize the ones that are very closely related to financing, was that the main factor that affected the sustainability of these investments was the governance and/or the management by the community. There were two reasons. In the areas where the community committees that were managing the investments, known as sustainability committees, where they had been well trained, they had adequate capacity to undertake continuous monitoring and address any problems quickly. They were able to reach out to different partners to support them to keep their investments going. And secondly, a general lack of finances by the community and local government led to some non-functionality of the investments. For example, money had not been set aside from the initial design to maintain the projects on a regular basis. Therefore, if something happens, there was a breakdown or a disaster, then the process of rehabilitating or just general maintenance was quite a challenge. The second main issue was severe climate disasters. For example, that region experienced a lot of extended droughts, which were then followed by severe floods, and this destroyed some of the infrastructure. And some of the reasons for this was poor siting of the investments and some technical design flaws of some of these investments that suffered from this catastrophe. So in conclusion, recommendations from these finance-related issues that arose that we found out from this longitudinal study was that there is need to have continuous capacity building of community sustainability committees, because they are the ones who own this resource, but they don't necessarily know how to manage it. So a lot of effort and resources should be put that aside post-investment of the climate investments for regular maintenance. And thirdly, adequate consultation with communities and technical experts during the design phase of an investment is quite critical in ensuring that the investments that are made during climate change for climate adaptation actually are sustainable for a long period of time. Thank you.
Thanks, Pauline. Really fantastic to see such a concrete example, and I think such a unique study of this longitudinal monitoring of the outcomes of these efforts. Really, a really important piece of work. Thanks for sharing that with us. The importance of capacity building for communities, the need for longer term funding. This is not a once-off investment, it's a long-term relationship, if you like, and also the need for technical input at the end. They're really fantastic. All right, so if anyone has questions specifically for Pauline, Pauline, please do track the Q&A. We can respond to some things there, and otherwise I'll put them to the floor afterwards. It's my pleasure now to invite Emile to come online. We're now going to zoom out. We're going to move from the county and national funds up into a partnership between the Climate and Development Knowledge Network and the UNFCCC. So really excited to hear about this work. Emile, over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Georgina. And thanks also to Megan and Pauline for really framing these different scales on climate finance access. As Georgina has mentioned, this is really kind of zooming out and looking at global, regional, but also how countries in respective regions are being supported to raise ambition. So certainly a higher level, but hopefully I'll get through some detail and create some clarity around what CDKN did in terms of a co-creation process to co-ideate ambitious regional programs and how that can relate to country priorities as well. So onto the next slide, please. So what is the needs-based finance project? Just for some brief context. So effectively, it arose from COP decisions where the parties were requesting the UNFCCC Secretariat to effectively support regions, very importantly in a country-driven manner, to articulate and assess what their climate finance priorities, barriers, and challenges were, and importantly, support regions and countries to translate this into action. And importantly here is going beyond just capacity building, but actually trying to facilitate the mobilization and access to climate finance. And in brief, the needs-based finance project works across these three phases that you see on your screen. Phase 1 is a technical assessment of climate finance needs and flows. Stage 2 is taking what comes out of those technical assessments and co-creating and packaging in a country and regionally driven manner these climate finance access and mobilization strategies. And phase 3 is really where CDKN came in and started to work with the Secretariat and other partners on the implementation of the strategies and actually translating these priorities and needs, etc., into climate finance regional programs, specifically looking at multilateral climate finance sources, and we'll unpack that in a moment, but also looking at various different dimensions of regional needs and barriers to mobilizing and accessing climate finance, which could also include private sector, for example. So onto the next slide and unpacking in very brief the role CDKN played in that phase 3. And effectively through South North, which is the organization I work for, which is also one of the partners in CDKN, we have an MOU, the Secretariat. They initially had invited us in as sort of a resource organization to help them unpack and understand how they could meaningfully and impactfully not just roll out these trainings, but actually lead to really tangible program ideas that could be taken forward. So effectively, we help to design a peer-to-peer training and co-ideation process for countries or member states rather of different regional economic commissions or cooperation bodies to conceptualize regional programs. And this resulted in the end in us leading six trainings and workshops in the regions in front of you, as well as then really fleshing out and understanding how this co-creation process can work at a regional level where you have multiple countries that may have various different priorities. Some of them might be conflicting, etc. How is it that you can convene them and raise ambition whilst also addressing these barriers and challenges in climate finance access? And the next slide, I think, really starts to unpack some of the ideas that we had to factor in understanding this particular process. And so one of the comments from one of our Secretariat colleagues that really helped me understand the needs-based finance project was that they saw it very much as a techno-political process. And I thought that was something that made it quite unique. It was trying to get high-level political buy-in at the regional level and for member states of these regional economic commissions, but it was also trying to bring the technical aspects into how to conceptualize these programs to address the needs articulated in these strategies. So some of the factors then I considered, along with colleagues from the Secretariat and the funds as well, is how do we respond to this diverse range of people in the room? And that pertains to both technical and sectoral experience, as well as people coming from different ministries and departments with different mandates, but aligned to what the needs-based project was. And so it was initially conceptualized as a training workshop, and I think it really sort of evolved into a peer-to-peer learning and co-ideation process. And the second point here also relates to the first, but that there were countries coming in with very different levels of experience with access to climate finance. There were some countries that had their GCF National Designated Authority in the room, where their country had accessed substantial amounts of GCF funding, and some countries that hadn't accessed much multilateral climate finance at all. And so part of that then influenced this peer-to-peer approach so that we could leverage the immense expertise and experience in the room. Point number 3, I think, really came to the fore in certain regions where power dynamics and geopolitics were at play as well. How do we create a process that is equal and fair and allows all countries to contribute, but also express their priorities in a way that then can be negotiated and discussed in how that then translates to programs and ultimately access to finance and action? And number 4, I think also relates to point number 3 around navigating different priorities, with some of these being potentially conflicting. Some regions, for example, there is a fair amount of tension around transboundary water resource management, for example. And so conceptualizing regional programs around transboundary water resource management could be potentially a contentious area to move into. And so we had to consider those factors as well. And point number 5, I think, is an important one, and one that should be considered deeply whenever trying to approach a process like this, is what are the desired outcomes and ultimately what's achievable, given the amount of time available to run the process, the resources available for taking the next steps and moving things forward, and really trying to balance those out so that within a 3 or 4 day workshop that we could come out with really strong outcomes that were achievable and could be articulated at the beginning of the process. And that sort of leads me into my next slide. If you could just pop over to the next one, which is actually establishing this peer-to-peer co-creation process and some of the elements that went into it, considering then some of these key factors. So number one in a peer-to-peer learning process or environment is acknowledging and expressing that everyone in the room is an expert in their own regard, whether that be sector-based or whether it be given their region or country or within the understanding of how action takes place within their context, acknowledging that first and foremost as a principle for why we are approaching this as a process, and to address some of those factors that I mentioned before as well. Number two is clarity and agreement and a strong buy-in to what the outcomes are. And point number 5 in the previous slide was really talking about what's desired and what's achievable. And so within that establishment of that process with stakeholders is really understanding, well, what are the outcomes that we're really working towards, and keeping that as sort of a guiding North Star. And number 3 is really clarifying with everyone in the room how this process will unfold. And particularly when this is a 3 or 4 day process, can be quite technical, but can also be quite political as well, requiring countries to really hash it out and negotiate amongst themselves, is where the docking points for being able to pause and reflect and have countries actually express themselves either in plenary or coming to me or the Secretariat and expressing concerns. And we've certainly navigated those spaces in different regions, but certainly having that clarity that this is a process, that everyone is meant to be contributing, and that there are these docking points for further discussion. Number 4, and I think this is something that really helps to give a feeling that momentum is building, is clarity and agreement on next steps and timelines. And coupled with that is what are the resources that are actually going to be made available to ensure that those next steps are actually taken within these agreed upon timeframes. And the 5th point is really fostering open and frank discussion and critical thinking around what it is we're trying to achieve, but doing so in a productive manner that is still moving us towards those outcomes. And I'm sure many of you that have worked within multilateral or more geopolitical spaces will know that we need open and frank conversation so that those next steps can be realized, but that we do need to understand that things can be derailed quite easily in some of these multilateral spaces. And so how do we create principles and understanding that we're all experts, we're all moving towards these outcomes, there's a process in place, there will be next steps, but that we really want to actually communicate openly, but in a productive way that is also frank. So moving us on, and I've got a few pictures to show. This was from the first workshop, and what's really interesting here is that the people standing around this table are all from the respective secretariats, the GCF, the Adaptation Fund, and the GEF. And what we have at the table is effectively what I call during this process, a multi-country program team. So they've sort of ideated this idea based on what their national priorities are and what they want to put forward as potential regional program ideas to be prioritized. And then they've got to actually sit at these tables and go through this process of hashing it out as to what will actually make it into this program. So it has to be a coherent, cohesive regional program. It can't include everything. And so they need to discuss and negotiate what that might look like. And I remember during this workshop, Yolanda Velasquez, the head of climate finance for the Secretariat, came to me and he said, isn't this quite unique that it's like the funds are moving from table to table and speaking with one voice? And if you're familiar with some of the challenges with multilateral climate finance and what some would say the lack of harmonization or coordination amongst the funds that can lead to duplicated effort, et cetera, this was quite a unique moment. You've got very key stakeholders. The actual funds are in the room. You've got international accredited entities, potentially national or regional accredited entities in the room. You have people from the respective member states that are mandated to have these discussions, all convening together in a process where outcomes are clear and we can raise ambition. To the next slide, please. So I'm just going to flick through these quite quickly because it's just to give you a visual reference to what the room kind of looks like during these workshops. This was from Southeast Asia. We have the East Caribbean states. through the Organization for East Caribbean States. And then the last picture is from the East African community and East African countries. And so it really is intended to be very hands-on, and really moving away from these sort of top-down technical trainings to actually putting countries and regions in a position to be empowered to create programs or ideate programs based on their priorities from a national perspective, and then how that translates up to regional level. So to the next slide, please, and I'll be wrapping up soon. So what did these trainings achieve? So over the last 18 months or so, starting from that very first training in the Maldives for Indian Ocean island states, and up until the West Africa training towards the end of last year, over 150 government officials from 80 countries across 8 regions and subregions have been trained on actually accessing the multilateral climate finance that is available, but really the nuance around how that programming works, and actually how the finance is accessed. And what this resulted in is 31 potential regional program ideas that were co-ideated and created by countries coming together and hashing it out amongst themselves based on their needs and their priorities, and then engaging with the funds as well throughout that process, as well as then other technical and resource people in the room. And so the high-level estimated ambition, having been a part and having led these processes, is around $1 billion to $2 billion in climate finance. And we see a range of programs that emerged, from cities-focused programs in the Caribbean to nature-based solutions in West Africa and East Africa and Southeast Asia, really spanning and cutting across a range of different sectors and areas for climate action, and really leveling up the ambition collectively as countries on trying to address these needs and linking it back to national priorities. What is in your NDC? Who are your national institutions that you want to be building up, either to become accredited to access the finance themselves, maybe they are accredited already, or could act as executing entities, etc. Really getting countries to think through how they bring private sector and civil society into these discussions as well, and articulating ambition to access finance where it may not have been there before, at least at this regional level, at least at this level of detail. Onto the next slide, please. So just to wrap up by saying what it is that I think we particularly learned as CDK and through this process. One is that there's so much value in countries coming together to lead and co-ideate together what these programs could look like, versus what is more the status quo, which is international agencies, for example, UNDP and others, who are international accredited entities who may conceptualize these regional program ideas, with a lot of criticism coming further down the line about the level of country ownership, disparities and access to the finance by the different countries, and whether or not implementation on the ground or in these countries is going to be effective. And so really seeing here countries putting forward these ideas themselves and really driving the process, and just seeing how much buy-in and value can be attained from that. The second aspect here is there needs to be a clear link to implementation. And I mentioned this up at the beginning of the presentation, clear next steps at the beginning, and how this can actually raise ambition and get buy-in. Everyone feels like we're very purposefully moving in a particular direction with a particular process that has been designed to get us there. Thirdly, the peer-to-peer approaches can be incredibly efficient and effective across multiple objectives. We were trying to train government officials, but we were simultaneously trying to raise ambition and conceptualize regional program ideas that then could be supported by the needs-based finance project moving forward. Fourth, the shift from incremental project approaches to systemic programmatic approaches. And we see this with the GCF a lot, that they're really pushing programmatic approaches. And one aspect here was how countries were starting to learn from each other as they were trying to collaborate and raise ambition together. An example there, the Seychelles had a $10 million coral reef restoration program, or project rather, and then they proposed a $100 million multi-country regional coral reef restoration program based on their learnings and how they went about a much smaller project at a national level. And lastly, the complementarity amongst these climate funds has not fully been realized yet. And it was really great to have all of them in the room and to be able to really understand these differential potential roles that they could play and talking that through with countries at this very early stage of ideation. And I'll leave it there and happy to answer further questions in the chat. Thanks.
Thanks, Emil. Really, really fascinating. Again, a really concrete example of, in this case, how you and the team have been working toward increasing access to finance. So we've heard across these three speakers. We've just had this introduction to efforts to work with countries on a regional scale with large climate funds. The question there is, how do you get money down to the national level? Then we had Pauline talking about, right, you've got money at the national level. How are you going to get that down to counties and communities? And we had Megan right in the beginning talking about, well, how do you make sure that all voices are heard when that starts getting implemented for locally led adaptation in the case of Cameroon and ICLEI Africa's long-term work with cities in this space. So thank you to all of our speakers for that. And I'm going to invite Bim to give us just a few minutes, 3 minutes or so, your reflections on what you've heard. And I appreciate you're hearing all of this for the first time, so I'm interested in your sort of reaction to what you've heard, Bim. While Bim is speaking, I would just encourage folks who have questions, you can raise your hand in the meantime. I'll be monitoring the Q&A because we'll transition from Bim's remarks to a Q&A period. So over to you, Bim.
Thank you, Georgina, and hi everyone, and thanks for the three colleagues. I think have done a tremendous job. So I have like a few, like a few border specific and few kind of high level comments, and I'll try to do my best to do that within like 4 or 5 minutes. So first, obviously, as Johannes, I think highlighted in his remark, I think it's really a timely topic because as we aim for more localized climate finance research, I think this kind of study is really important for us to inform the climate policy. So I have like 4 or 5 points. The first one around like data and climate finance and how we track the adaptation finance at the local level. As we know, I think the climate finance tracking at the global level is improving, but still there is a lot of challenge. Particularly at the local level, we really don't know how much money is going or what is the delivery and access looks like. So I think from the more like a data and the kind of adaptation finance tracking kind of side, I think perhaps there is like some room for us to kind of do further research here, because this data and the tracking is important because of to know how much public and private finance flowing to climate adaptation mitigation. And also some of you have mentioned the gender kind of lens investment as well. But we really don't have a more like a gender disaggregated kind of analysis around the climate finance, because when we start the project, we try to tag the project, whether the project is gender responsive or gender sensitive. But I think that when we finish the project, we have some kind of problem there really, what really came out from the project in terms of kind of gender aspect. And also, I think some of you also talk about how we can align the climate investment. So I think, again, that here the role of data is very important. And finally, I think if you want to estimate the adaptation of finance needs at the local level, again, the role of data is very important. So I think in the absence of this kind of data, I think the need assessment at the local level, there is a tendency, always to underestimate the true cost of data adaptation at the local level. So that's my first point on the more data and climate finance tracking at the local level. And second, also, I think some of you also, like Emil's presentation, talks about the sectoral flow of climate finance, because we really need to understand, whether or not, the most potential sector is really attracting, enough climate finance. So if you look at the, finance flow so far, there is a report from the CPI just like a few weeks back. If you look at the mitigation side, almost like a 70% finance is going to either to energy or transport sector. And on the other hand, if you look at the agriculture and industry kind of side, which has a huge potential of, greenhouse gas reduction. If you look at the IPCC report, the agriculture and industry combined can, kind of contribute to, 20 gigaton of carbon by 2030. So this sector only receive 4% of the, overall climate finance. And if you look at the emerging technology, for example, battery storage, hydrogen, those kind of areas, so we also don't have enough financing flowing, these particular sectors. And on the cities as well, Megan already highlighted, I think there's a very important sector where we have both adaptation and mitigation potential, if you like, kind of co-benefit. So this is really not the sector, getting enough attention in my view as well. That's more on the mitigation kind of story. If you look at the adaptation side, I think we have a same story here, although I think the adaptation finance is going up. Again, I'm referring to that CPI report here, about like a 63 billion but now I think it's up 2023. But still, I think some of the sector are not really benefiting, compared to the more on the mitigation kind of side. Particularly, like if you look at the agriculture and forestry and land use sectors, which has a huge potential of, reducing carbon and the other kind of greenhouse gases. And it is only receiving like 11% of the adaptation finance. So I think this is a really kind of huge gap here, how we really can push for the, finance flowing to the, some of the very potential sectors. That's something I think I really would like to emphasize here. I think that came somehow in the second presentation, Paulina. I think your sector analysis of the water sectors. I was really delighted to see how much really finance is flowing to the water kind of sector here. And also, I think, Emil, I think your presentation also kind of pointed out the need for the sectoral experience, and when you talk about the need-based finance. So that's my second kind of quick comment. And third comment on the more like a private financing side. So Johannes, I think you highlighted that in your opening remark. We really need to kind of mobilize more private finance. So if you look at again the track adaptation finance, the private sector's contribution is still not that enough. And then we have been hearing, this why private sector is not investing. And there's a lot of argument, we didn't have a supply of the bankable project. The adaptation is risky investment for the private sector to invest. So and so on. But, this is like almost 10 years we have been hearing this kind of debate. But private sector investment is still not the kind of, increasing, the way I think we like to see it increase. So that's something I think at the local level, perhaps it's a really interesting kind of research kind of idea as well, why I think private sector flow is not increasing. But if you look at if you just unpack the private sector finance, it's basically the household level finance, almost like, as far as I know, 49% private finance coming from the household kind of sector. And more recently, I think these finances have been mobilized for the, like emerging technology, like, electrical vehicle, for example, or EV sales, or with the batteries, those kind of things. But still, I think what I think that it will be very interesting to see what percentage of the household private finance is going to adaptation versus mitigation. So that's something, I would be very interesting. And then I don't think that any of the presentation really captured that point. And the fourth point on that, about how we can align the kind of finance from different sources. Again, I think last presentation from Emil, I think you already highlighted that. Right now, I think we have different sort of kind of financings. If you look at the country level, there are 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different kind of financing. And how we can really align this finance really to achieve impact at scale. That's what I see the biggest gap here. We have MDB finance, mostly obviously public finance. There are other finances coming as well. But I think we simply don't see this kind of alignment between the different financing mechanisms, different donors. So that's really a challenge. And then at the local level, how we should be going about it. Perhaps that will be one area of the knowledge gap as well. And my final presentation around is scale and the quantity and the quality of finance. Most of the time, our focus is on the more money, like the volume of finance I think we need to mobilize. And that's really right. That's a good in its own right. But if you look at the more like a little bit of quality side, we don't know really too much about the, what kind of, benefit these climate finance are generating at the local level. Or perhaps we might be maladapting, we don't know. So we don't really know much about the, the quality of this climate finance at the local level. What I think the next kind of generation of research project has to be really kind of working on that particular area, what that, effectiveness of climate adaptation finance looks like. So that's the one kind of really gap I see. And the second also, how we can simplify, kind of these taxonomies, kind of reporting kind of side at the local level as well. I know we have like, this border kind of a taxonomy at the global level, but I think there's also need for us to really work on that. Further, like a transparency kind of standpoint that alluded by Megan, in her presentation. So we really need to go about how we can have this very context-specific local kind of setup, taxonomy, how we can standardize reporting kind of requirement. That's something that would be very interesting kind of research kind of angle as well. So I noted that Megan, you have highlighted some of those criteria. Pauline also mentioned the need for the local legislation and governance kind of issues. So these are, I think, other area I think it should be very important for, when you talk about the climate finance from the local perspective, kind of local level. And also there are bigger like a macro or fiscal policy, I think we cannot ignore as well, because how the country is aligning their fiscal policy to meet their kind of NDC target. And that's something, wherever I go, I really highlight this topic because country is still investing on the more like hydrocarbon sector, but at the same time, we have this very ambitious NDCs and also the net zero vision. So how we really go about really aligning this macro and fiscal policy to countries, I think, NDC commitment, but in a low carbon vision. So that's something I think we really need to think about as well. Not only, I think all the local kind of issues are pretty much linked to the bigger macro and fiscal issues as well. So as a research community, I think that's where I see also some opportunity here for us to think further. So Georgina, maybe I'll just stop here and happy to come back later if there are any further questions on this.
Great, thanks, Bim. All right, so we've heard from 3 speakers. We've had some challenges from Bim, thinking forward, looking at those big issues on the horizon. We're going to open it up to the floor now for questions. I see, Pauline, you've got a couple of questions in the chat. Perhaps I'm going to throw out a broader question to which any of our panelists could respond. If you are a panelist, please just turn on your cameras so we can all see you. Feel free, there's just 4 of you to simply unmute. Also, Jonas, 5 of you, unmute and just respond if you'd like to. So Pauline, there's some quite sort of specific questions for you in the Q&A. I think I'll allow you to answer those from Nicholas Azor, asking about who provided the initial finance for communities, what was the channel through which it was received, the roles of ADA, etc. I think some of those can be answered quite specifically in the chat. However, there is a question for you, Pauline, about opportunities to share this experience with other organizations and with other countries. So if you could share how, I know that ADA in collaboration with CDKN has been thinking about how to share these lessons with the national audience in particular, if you could share some of that. And then I have a question that's on my mind listening to you all. And it's this tension between, it's something Megan raised a little while back, the tension between technical assistance, which is, for those of you who aren't familiar with this area, we're talking about consultants coming in, supporting countries or teams to write proposals and then leaving. So it's a kind of fly in, fly out kind of support versus what we've heard today, which is predominantly walking the long road with these teams, spending time, the insights from Pauline's work. This is not a once-off investment, it's long-term. What Megan was talking about, how to bring these stakeholders together over the long run, essentially the role of knowledge brokers and co-creation processes versus traditional technical assistance, where my instinct is that there's still a role for that, but I'm interested to hear what you all think. So let me pause there while I see if there's any hands raised. Over to, I think maybe Pauline, if you could respond to this question about how your team is going about sharing the lessons that have been learned from your work. And then this open question around traditional technical assistance versus longer term brokering in overcoming these blockages that we've heard about. Over to you, Pauline.
Okay, thank you very much. Going to the first question about how we are sharing our work and our experiences. We've had several opportunities. First, we've had the opportunity to share the work at the COP UNFCCC COP conference, both COP27 and COP28. So that is one platform that we have used to share this work. We have done a lot of research papers and policies and information briefs that we have shared online through various networks. For example, the longitudinal study is a work that was partnered with SSN through the CDKN network, and it is also on their platforms and shared through their networks as well. We have had different governments or institutions interested in seeing the experience of Kenya, experiencing it coming over. For example, last year, but one, we hosted a team from Uganda that wants to put up a similar framework within their legal system, and they came over and we spent a whole week with them talking about the legal framework, going to different government offices, and then going to the field to communities to see how it looks like, the community participation angle and the sustainability angle from communities. We've also participated in seminars like this one, or we've had some requests even from some teams, example from one of the states in India that were putting up their climate change legislation, and they wanted to learn from our experience to see if there was anything that they can borrow that would be useful on their end, especially with regard to the community side, the local adaptation and all that. So we are quite open to sharing our experience. We feel that this framework or components of it can be borrowed for different kinds of regimes. We are lucky in Kenya because of our devolved system of governance has picked up very well, and therefore it does give us an advantage in terms of devolving climate finance to local governments. So that we have had an advantage as Kenya, but there are still principles of locally led adaptation that regardless of the kind of governance regime in a country, that can be utilized in projects and programs in those countries for climate adaptation. I want to now speak to the question about technical support, how it is given to the communities and expertise. This, our framework, the CCCF, is designed in such a manner that the primary technical expertise is given to communities by government officers who are experts and employed by the county governments, the subnational governments. These are people who are already on the government payroll, and it is their work to ensure that whatever component of expertise that is needed, it is availed when needed by the communities. The water engineers, the climate meteorologists, any kind of the agriculturalists, all of them are put by virtue of the legislation into a committee that is a technical committee that provides input before, during the design of projects by communities, and during the implementation of the project, and even after, during the management. It is a legal requirement. It is input in the law for that very reason, to avoid a scenario where communities are running around trying to hire experts from wherever. So that is how this particular mechanism is designed. Let me just mention that the kind of projects that are designed by communities are not huge mega projects that would require huge amounts of money and a lot of expertise that is beyond what is available by our local experts. So that is the design of this funding. It is, and then also because we want once the projects are implemented and handed over to the community, they are at such a scale that the local community can sustainably manage them for the rest of time, with a little input here and there from the local government. So with regard to those two questions, that is how our framework looks like. Thank you.
Thanks, Pauline. So we've got a question on the table around technical assistance versus long-term monitoring, long-term brokering approaches for our speakers. If anyone would like to address those, I'd like to throw another one at you as you're considering that. So there's another question, Pauline. It's aimed at you, but I think it's for all of us, or all of the speakers, about how How can we achieve local leadership in these projects? We have a climate finance system where money is, by virtue of how it's managed, is coming from national down to local, international to national. And so you have this de facto top-down process. And so this issue of local leadership and the difference between locally implemented projects versus locally led projects and how this plays in an adaptation finance space, I think is particularly challenging. So if anyone would like to speak to that, there's that one. The other piece is when we get the locally led aspect of this right, if we have local priorities, there's a possibility that some of those local priorities are potentially a little bit short term, in the sense of, you know, people are experiencing changes right now. There's a challenge and it's an emergency right now, but aren't necessarily aware of what's coming down the road in 30 years' time in terms of climate change. So how do we find that balance between these activities that are both locally led, but also located within our broader understanding of the climate challenges that are coming down the road? So I'll open that up. Those small questions back over to the floor. Bim, Emil, Megan, Jonas, anyone who'd like to come in on those?
Thanks.
Oh, I see hands up. I'm sorry. There's a hand here, Megan, and then Emil. Sorry, I was in the attendees section. I thought none of you wanted to talk. Go ahead.
Happy to reflect a bit on the first question, because we've been grappling a lot with technical assistance versus knowledge brokering, which are quite different in how they operate. I mean, certainly from our experience in terms of, because there's a lot of discussion around TA for TA's sake, and so much money for TA, but less and less money for actual direct implementation, and frustration from our cities because they want implementation and not just more technical assistance on their projects. Certainly from our perspective, you know, in terms of what TA we should be trying to avoid, I think it should be, you know, TA that's not prioritizing co-production, whether it's TA or knowledge brokering. Co-production is absolutely critical, and that's going to determine how sustainable and successful projects that are implemented are. There's also this piece around, and there's been, you know, written on this. It came up in Africa Climate Week a few years back about the link between global north and climate change, and wanting to move away from a situation in global north solutions are imposed on global south with global north money, and this kind of recycling of global north money to global north. And then also for us, you know, which has been a learning we've had to sometimes learn the hard way, is not wanting to focus any technical assistance or any work really we do with community scale or city scale on finance that we know is unlikely to be unlocked for those projects, because we already know about the impenetrable challenges. We already know about credit worthiness issues. We know about ticket sizes in the finance landscape. So I think in some senses, if we are all honest, there's been time and money spent on working on projects that were unlikely to be financed, which you could have told, you know, understood from the outset based on some of the barriers we already understood in terms of what's occurring in this landscape. So I think what Pauline's sharing about projects that can be small scale and manageable at the community level are critical, because it's this balance between a lot of the banks and DFIs looking for very large ticket size projects that are relatively low risk. There's this, you know, issue of lack of concessional finance, lack of grant finance. So finding this balance between, we need to change the broader landscape that Bim was speaking about, so that larger scale finance can flow in ways that are more locally led and gender responsive, twinned with also small scale finance that can be managed directly by community members. I think it's not an and or, we need both. Thanks.
Yeah, great points, Megan, and agree on a lot of that. So just to touch back on the point I made about the needs-based finance project being this techno-political process. And I think having engaged with it and seeing the intention behind that has been really interesting over the past sort of 18 months. And, you know, incorporate, and again, this is at the regional level, and it is at a much sort of higher level than, you know, considering TA at, say, local or city or subnational, even national level, is seeing the importance of having the political process that goes along with the technical process, because some of these technical processes can result in pipelines being developed, but those pipelines sit and gather dust on a shelf because the actual political process that would have got the buy-in and help actually unlocking that longer process and actually getting to mobilizing that finance wasn't in place. So for this, at least with needs-based finance, having the regional economic commissions, so for example, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, be one of the co-conveners and taking the pipeline that comes out of this co-creation process to their next ministerial level meeting to get ministers from the member state countries to agree that this is now a part of the regional pipeline, and then allowing the NBF project to then bring in the technical assistance, etc., to start pushing that forward, I think has been really interesting. So at least at that level, understanding how we can sort of move away from just parachuting in with TA. And the one thing I'll say to end off on this is that the next phase of the needs-based finance project, which CDCAN will also be involved in, but also helping to shape based on learnings, is going to be focusing a lot more on embedding regional and national level capacity around some of what we did in the first phase, but also taking a whole set of additional issues forward as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Emil. Bim, I see your hand. I'd like you to just hold it for a moment. I'd like to give Makame, who's one of our attendees, an opportunity to voice his question. We've got 5 minutes left, so I think we'll do that, and then we'll start wrapping up. Over to you, Makame.
Hello, thank you so much for giving me the floor. My name is Makame Mahmood. I'm working as a project officer at the South Asia, Bangladesh. So my question is in terms of local leadership. So my question to speakers that so what would be the best mechanism for developing community leader, if I specify on that, on long-term basis? Because whatever we do for community level people, so for capacity building, whatever we do through climate financing, but that there should be some people who have some good idea, better idea in local level. So in that regards, that might be an scope to make them a leader because they stay there long term.
Thanks, Makame. I think what I'll do, we've got 4 minutes left. Jonas, I think you would be in a good position to respond to. I mean, I think all of our panelists could respond to this question, but because we're up against time, Jonas, could I invite you to respond and sort of share your sort of take-home messages that you've heard across the webinar?
Maybe I ask him to quickly respond because I see that and connect with whatever you wanted to say. Then I'll say a few closing sentences.
Okay, so Ben, why don't you come in with your remarks, and then we'll
very
go
quickly, Georgina, very quickly. I totally agree with Emil and Megan on the some of the steps they mentioned. Just only one thing I add would be little capacity issue. I think even the last question was around the how we can create this kind of capacity at the local level. So many of the like even GCF proposal are decline on the quality ground. So that's a really area I think how we really can empower the local kind of institution to really kind of compete for this kind. That's one area. And my second quick point on how we align again like a bigger player like MDBs, for example, or the regional banks, because I think that's where I see that this alignment is not happening unless they really would like to work with the local institution or local kind of actors. So right now we haven't seen that, because if you look at the country strategy of the many like regional banks or the MDBs, they are very ambiguous about their local kind of engagement strategy. So that's a word I think I really would like to push forward. And if we can convince this regional big institution and the organization like Green Climate Fund or GCF would be really would be easy for them to bring on board. So anyway, that's an area we really need to focus on. Otherwise, I think it really hard to hear the voice coming from the local institution unless we have this bigger allies on the table.
Thanks, Bim. All right, Jonas, over to you to send us out with a bang. And to all of those of you who are on the line still, thank you for sticking with us.
Thank you, Georgina. I think three things coming out. Number one is the aspect of multidimensionality of the tension in sort of bringing climate finance for local-led adaptation. there seem to be the horizontal tension where the ideas are designed. But again, that's a source tension for sort of devolution or devolving the financing to the local level. And I think it's more because during that, like what Amail has shown, during the conversation around the design and the architecture of these funding situations, there seem to be very limited voices and aspirations of the local people at the bottom. So it means that there is a gap, in terms of what comes out of those horizontal conversation. And perhaps that's why there seem to be a lot of technical assistance, because then there's need really to bring all this high-level thing to really suit the local context. And therefore, my biggest fear, Georgina, is that we remain stuck in this conversation, which is basically more about institutional arrangements and rearrangements rather than the institutional shifts that are required really to create equity, to create inclusivity in the ways these fundings are being designed, and to enable them to really reach the local people where this is really needed. The second point relates to what Beam has highlighted, which is about the data, the quality, the data in terms of what exactly does local level adaptation mean? And that also raises the question around, what is it that, what's the quality of the financing in terms of the financing that comes in whatever quantity? Is it really supporting the real things that are really responding to the vulnerabilities of the marginalized groups? And that's why the issue of data is very important. And if you think about it in the context of the Llama project, where we are trying to really build the aspirations and the matrices about what makes sense for the different groups, so that investments can be targeted in a quality way. So that, in a way, can really try to sort out this issue around the quality of financing that could really progress adaptation for the most vulnerable groups within the community. And finally, Georgina, I think there is this element of sustainability, which we have not, has not been tackled quite well. But I guess there is the tension between the grant funding, which dominates the adaptation space, and the sort of private sector business models. We've done some studies on effectiveness of adaptation interventions in East Africa. And one of the things that emerges, and what BM already said, is the fact that about almost 90% of the adaptation projects interventions are funded through grants. And within those grants, there are no provisions to really develop some form of business frameworks or sort of marketized perspective, so that the grant funding, when the projects end, can be transitioned into some business venture for sustainability. So the question of sustainability is very critical. It's not just institutional, but it's also about how these funds are really designed to enable the sustainability element. So maybe it is important to start thinking about how do we push the grant funding system to integrate some element of business framework, market aspects in their design in ways that enables that transition and enables sustainability and attraction of more private sector funding. So those are some of the three things that I would see coming out of the discussion, but really just the beginning of this continued conversation. And I do hope we can move from the known, like the arrangements that needs to be changed, into really asking difficult questions that really needs to be answered, especially questions that can lead to shift in systems, because that's the only thing that will remove us from this space where we are stuck in for a very long time. Thank you, Georgina.
Thanks, Jonas. Fantastic closing remarks. A lot of challenges ahead, and I'm sure as a Step Change community and others who are on the line will have very many more opportunities to explore this further. So I think it just falls to me now with 3 minutes over time. Just a big thank you to our speakers. Thank you to those who've attended, and as I said, who've stayed on despite us going a little bit over time. Thank you very much, everyone. for joining us, and stay tuned via social media. We have another 2 webinars coming up in the next month or so. All right, so thanks everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.